Some women have spent their entire lives believing their bodies were the reason men sin. Because of one verse, one misunderstood verse. Matthew 5, verse 27 to 28, was used to make women feel dangerous, tempting, shameful. But what if Jesus was never condemning women's body at all? What if he was actually confronting the hearts of men? Most people grew up hearing this verse explained one way. If a man lost, then somehow the woman must have caused it. Maybe it was what she wore. Maybe she was showing too much. Maybe she smelled too much, or looked too confident, or attracted attention without meaning to. And after hearing messages like that again and again, a lot of women quietly started carrying shame that was never supposed to belong to them. Some women learned to cover themselves, not out of personal conviction, but fear. Fear of being blamed, fear of making someone stumble, fear of existing in the wrong way. And for a lot of young girls, this verse became tied to body shame really early. Before they even understood attraction, before they even understood relationships, they just knew being noticed felt dangerous. And I think that's the heartbreaking part, because many people genuinely believe they were teaching holiness. But somehow along the line, the focus moved away from the heart of the person looking and landed almost completely on the woman being looked at. But that's not actually the full meaning of what Jesus was saying. And I think a lot of people don't realize how radical his words were in that moment. Because when Jesus said this, he was speaking into a culture where women were being objectified. In many ways, women were treated like they were properties than full human beings. Their values were tied to marriage, purity, childbearing, and honestly, men held most of the social and religious power. So when Jesus started talking about lust, notice what he does. He doesn't turn to the woman and say, make sure men don't think sinful thoughts about you. He doesn't say, women, your bodies are the problem. That's not what happens. Instead, he pulls the responsibility directly on the person looking. And that was a massive shift, because a lot of religious people at that time believed religiousness was mostly external. As long as you technically followed the law outward, you were considered morally clean. But Jesus kept doing this thing where he moved the conversation inwards. Not just murder, but anger. Not just adultery, but the condition of the heart. Not just outward behavior, but inward motives. And that completely changes how this verse should be understood. Because Jesus was not saying attraction itself is sinful. He wasn't trying to say noticing beauty is evil. He wasn't condemning women for existing in bodies that people find attractive. He was confronting the mindset that reduces another human being into an object for personal gratification. That is very different. There's a difference between noticing someone is beautiful and mentally consuming them in a way that ignores their humanity. And honestly, I think somewhere through those years, that distinction got lost. The focus slowly shifted away from self-control, integrity, and the heart of the posture of the observer, and moved most entirely onto the woman's shoulder. So instead of teaching men responsibility over their own thoughts, some teaching made women feel responsible for managing male temptation all the time. And you can probably see the damage that caused. A lot of women grew up feeling their bodies were the problem to solve. like holiness meant becoming invincible, like being attracted automatically made them dangerous somehow. And I don't think that's what Jesus was trying to create at all. Because if you look at the way Jesus interacted with women throughout the scripture, he constantly treated them with dignity. He spoke to women publicly where society looked down on that. He listened to them. He defended them. He saw them as full people, not distractions. So, it feels strange when this one verse get used in ways that produce shame Jesus never modeled himself. And to be clear, Jesus was still taking lust seriously. He was saying sin begins in the heart before the actions happen outwardly. But the responsibility for that heart's posture belongs to the individual person, not to someone else for simply existing. And honestly, I think this conversation matters a lot more than people realize. Because even though this verse was written thousands of years ago, you can still see the impact of how it has been taught in real women's lives today. Some women still feel guilty for dressing up nicely. Some feel guilty for being attractive at all. Some constantly overthink how they sit, how they laugh, how they post online, how their body looks in certain clothes. Because deep down, they are afraid of being blamed for someone else's thoughts. And maybe nobody said those exact words directly to them. Sometimes it is more subtle than it is. It is the little eye comments, the side eyes, the warnings. Be careful what you wear. You don't want to cause another person to stumble. Cover up around men. And after hearing things like that over and over and over again, women quietly start carrying responsibility that was never theirs to carry. And honestly, I don't think most people mean harm when teaching it. A lot of parents, churches, leaders, they probably thought they were protecting holiness, protecting people, trying to encourage wisdom. But somewhere along the line, the conversation became more focused on managing women's appearances and not nearly focused enough on teaching people's responsibility over their own hearts. And that changes the feeling of the verse completely. Because if Jesus wanted to blame women here, he could have done that very directly, but he didn't. He addressed the person looking lustfully. That detail matters way more than people think. Especially now, in a world where women are constantly being watched, judged, commented on, and analyzed online. Social media honestly made this whole thing heavier. A woman can post a completely normal picture and still get inappropriate comments underneath it. And somehow, people will still ask what she expected or what message was she sending. And after a while, you start to realize this mindset runs really deep culturally, not just spiritually. People often expect women to manage other people's reaction for them. And I think that's the part of why so many women end up feeling disconnected from their own bodies spiritually. Like their bodies became problem instead of just being part of a human. Some women grew up thinking holiness meant becoming smaller, less noticeable, less feminine, less confident, almost like appearing and disappearing a little. And that's sad, honestly, because when you read the way Jesus interacted with women throughout the scripture, he never seemed uncomfortable around women's humanity. Other people were uncomfortable sometimes. Religious system were uncomfortable. Society definitely had issues with women, but Jesus constantly treated women with dignity. And that is why I think this verse deserves a slower reading. Because lust, in the deeper way Jesus talks about it, is not simply noticing someone is attractive. Human beings notice beauty, that's normal. The issue is what happens in the heart after that? Do you still see the person as a human being? Or do they slowly become an object in your mind, a fantasy, something to consume mentally without caring about their humanity anymore? That's a completely different conversation from women are responsible for men's thoughts. Think time. And honestly, I think those two ideas got mixed up together over time, especially in certain church environments where fear became deeply attached to sexuality. Some women learned to feel the shame of their bodies even before they even understood their bodies, which is heartbreaking when you really think about it. Young girls becoming hyper aware of themselves so early, pulling their clothes, trying to not attract attention, feeling guilty for developing physically, feeling too much without even knowing why. That kind of shame settle deep sometimes. I don't think Jesus was trying to create fearful women who constantly monitor their existence. At the time, though, I don't think Jesus was saying people should objectify each other carelessly either. And that is where this conversation needs balance. Because sometimes when people start pushing back against shame, others hear it as, so nothing matters now. But that's not what it means. Jesus was still taking the inner life seriously, very seriously, actually. He was saying sin can begin internally long before actions happen outwardly. Intentions matter. The way we view other people matter. But responsibility for those thoughts belong to the individual person. And honestly, that principle still feels really important because modern culture objectifies people constantly through pornography, through social media obsession, through unrealistic beauty standards, through treating people like they are visual content instead of actual human beings. And it affects everybody eventually. People start comparing themselves constantly, performing, consuming each other constantly. So, in a strange way, this verse still speaks powerfully today, just maybe not in the way many people first learned it. Maybe Jesus was never trying to teach women that their bodies were dangerous. Maybe he was challenging us all to examine how we see each other internally. Because there's a huge difference between appreciating beauty and reducing somebody into something that exists for your private consumption. And honestly, I think when you really sit with that difference, the entire passage starts feeling different. Less about shame, more about integrity. Less about fear, more about learning to see people with dignity again. Honestly, I think one of the reasons this verse hurts so many people is because scripture becomes very personal once shame gets attached to it. People don't just want to hear the verse anymore, they hear every painful thing that was said around the verse too. For some women, this passage reminds them of constantly feeling washed growing up, feeling like their bodies were somehow public responsibility. They had to carry the weight of everybody's self-control on their shoulders. And maybe some people listening to this still struggle with that quietly. Maybe you still overthink yourself all the time. Maybe you still feel guilty for being attractive. Maybe part of you still believes being noticed is spiritually dangerous somehow. And honestly, I don't think Jesus looked at women that way. When I read the gospel, I don't see Jesus constantly trying to make women feel ashamed for existing. I see him restoring dignity to people who had been carrying shame for years. And I think that matters because there's a difference between conviction and shame, even though people sometimes mix them together. Conviction leads you towards honesty, growth, responsibility. Shame just wants to make you hide. And a lot of people have been hiding emotionally for a very long time. Not because they love God less, not because they are rebellious, but because somewhere along the line, they started associating holiness with fear instead of freedom. And maybe that is why this conversation feels so emotional for some people. Because deep down, I think a lot of women are tired of feeling like problems that needs to be managed. Tired of feeling responsible for everyone else's thoughts. Tired of carrying shame Jesus never intended for them to carry in the first place. And maybe the real question this verse asks isn't how invincible women can become. Maybe the deeper question is, how do we learn to see each other with dignity? And maybe after this, you will never read this verse the same again. Because when you realize Jesus was confronting the hearts looking, not condemning women for existing, the whole passage shifts. It stops sounding like a warning against women's body, and it starts sounding like a call for deeper integrity, dignity, and responsibilities. There are so many scriptures people grew up fearing today because nobody slowed down enough to ask, what was Jesus actually saying here? And if this opened your eyes even for a little bit, stay with me. Because some of the verses people carry the shame from are also some of the most misunderstood.